Welcome to the Talking Transformation podcast, presented to you from Cape Town here in the Western Cape, South Africa. The podcast is presented with a view to providing a platform and voice for built environment professionals and interest groups who are working towards transforming the places and spaces here in South Africa. It's dedicated to the individuals and community groups who are supporting both the formal and informal processes that are shaping our cities and our spaces. In this fourth and final episode of the Deep Dive series, delivered in partnership with Sustainable Energy Africa, as part of the C40 Cities Net Zero Carbon Buildings programme, we look at issues of inclusion and reach of that programme. Most listening to the podcast in the series would recognise the severe urban housing backlogs in South Africa, and that urban informal settlements are often dictating the growth patterns of parts of our cities across South Africa. Within informal settlements, the shacks that dominate the landscape are generally built poorly out of tin and other materials. There's often no sanitation, often no plumbing, no running water, and limited access to electricity. So then, what is the relevance of the Net Zero Carbon Building Programme to those communities and others within the lower end of the property market? And most importantly, how can the custodians and the champions of the programme ensure that net zero carbon buildings and the building programme includes and embraces informality and lower income households? So in today's concluding session, we look at the context of the severe housing backlog in South Africa. Will this issue retard the low income housing development through the burden of having to meet additional requirements brought on by the Net Zero Carbon Building Programme? Is the Net Zero Carbon Building Programme a luxury we can't really afford? What are the opportunities that may arrive from savings for the households? And what are the opportunities to use alternative and more economic building materials in the construction and the capital costs that could ultimately result in reduced operating costs for those households? And at a time of recession, can government state-sponsored housing programs provide an impetus to actually lead the net zero carbon market and thinking? To assist us in answering these questions, we're joined by Liana Strader from the city of Johannesburg. You will have heard from Liana in the first two of our deep dive episodes earlier in the series. She's joined by David Gardner, an urban consultant and housing expert, and Mark Sherritt, who describes himself as a sustainability architect. As ever, we're joined by Megan Houston-Brown and Tlengiwe Radebe from Sustainable Energy Africa. It's a fascinating proposition, and the conversation that you're going to hear unpacks these issues and starts to suggest that in fact there are more opportunities than perhaps challenges. Listen for yourself, make up your own mind, and most importantly, enjoy the episode. So it's just gone 5:30 on May the 4th, and I'm absolutely delighted to be hosting the fourth and final conversation about the roadmap to net zero carbon buildings. And today we're taking a deep dive into the whole question of how do we make sure that we leave no one behind? The programme into communities, whether it's in the informal sector or the lower, more affordable housing component. And I'm joined by colleagues who are well understanding of these issues. Up in Johannesburg, we've got David Gardner, urban consultant. David, how are you keeping today? Really great to have you on the show.
Very good to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Absolutely welcome. And Mark Sherritt, sustainability architect, also up in Johannesburg. Mark, how are you keeping?
Very well, thanks.
Welcome, Mark. A more familiar name and voice on the recent podcast we got in the city of Johannesburg, Liana Strader. Liana, how are you keeping? All good? Nice to have you back on the show.
Thank you, Pete. I think I'm going to start claiming overtime for having these lovely chats with you after hours.
Well, you know what to send the invoice, hey, Liana, right?
A coffee would be great, Pete.
A coffee coming your way soon, virtual or real, whichever you're after. Last but certainly not least, from Sustainability Energy Africa, we have Megan Houston-Brown and Tlengiwe Radebe. Let's start with you first, Tlengiwe. How are you keeping? You all good?
I'm good, thanks, Pete. And thank you to our guests for joining us today. May the force be with us today.
May the fourth be with you indeed. And Megan, how are you keeping? All good?
I'm good, thanks, Pete. Really looking forward to today's conversation. As a country with such extremes in terms of wealth inequality, responding to climate change really is a challenge. How do you sort of rein in the overconsumption on one end, and on the other end, the need for development? And it's such sort of different situations. And I'm really looking forward to how do we chart a course through this.
What is the landscape in South Africa currently, David, and particularly those big cities where the majority of the population is residing and the buildings are? What is it that when we look at 2021, is a starting point for us to understand the degrees of informality and the lower income profile of those cities?
It's a good place to start, I think, is a step or two above that, to say why building a net zero carbon built environment is important. So we go back to the fact that South Africa is one of the largest polluters in the world. We're the 14th largest emitter of greenhouse gas, climate changing greenhouse gases in the world, on par with Australia, Mexico, Brazil, UK, Poland, and other major nations like that. We emit half of Africa's emissions. And if we go down a step then and we start looking at the built environment contribution in South Africa, roughly 1/3 of South Africa's greenhouse gas emissions come from our built environment. The residential sector comprises around 22% of that, specifically in the major metropolitan areas. So that's a really significant starting point to say that this is in fact a world-changing built environment in terms of the contributions it makes to greenhouse gas emissions. And I think it's important because when we get into the details of is this possible and how do we make it work, we need to bear in mind the consequences of not getting it to work as being a major outcome. So from there, we then start looking at the size of South Africa's residential sector. If we look at it in GDP terms, it is really huge. It comprises a significant proportion of the 173 billion rand that was created as part of South Africa's GDP in 2019. That is the entire built environment, and 23% of that, almost 1/4 of that GDP contribution, came from the residential sector in South Africa. So once again, a significant annual contributor to our growth, but at the same stage, a major contributor to our carbon emissions and other emissions. So let's then delve from there into the residential sector itself. We really have these two major parts of it: the formal built environment, which we would know as houses and flats and townhouses, comprising around 55% of all structures or units, residential units. And that's around 6.6 million formal housing units, everything from the palaces right the way down to the basic even sites and small houses that might be on the deeds registry. We then have around 45%, the balance of 5.4 million households living in informal houses of some form. And that really includes backyard rooms and backyard shacks being about 9% of all households, around 11% in informal settlements, around 1.3 million households, 1.2 million households in traditional structures still across the country, and then a balance in all sorts of other smaller types of accommodation. So before we get to the cities, I then just wanted to indicate a really important breakdown of the formal sector. Of that 6.6 million formal units, a significant proportion of those have been contributed since 1995 through the government housing subsidy program. And that at the moment looks something like around 3.2 million houses, RDP and BNG, as we would call them, subsidized houses, and then around 1.14 million serviced sites that have been produced. So a significant number funded by government, given to households who would otherwise not have access to accommodation. And this becomes a really important part of how we take it forward. In the cities, 70% formal accommodation, 30% informal accommodation. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks for that sort of scene setting, Dave, and reminding us of the quantum and also that legacy of the building of houses since 1994. And Mark, if I come to you, I mean, in terms of architectural solutions and approaches, a lot of the conversation we've had in the past 3 weeks has been around, let's call it that formal environment that David's spoken to in part. In terms of the deeper dive into the less formal, what is it that you're sensing from an architectural point of view, or the possibilities within this? And how do you think in terms of the opportunities to change things up, both in terms of policy and building approaches, that we can think about this as we work towards our commitments towards 2050?
My response to that is the biggest difficulty with informal settlements in general is kind of land tenure. So most of people have invaded a certain piece of land and they don't have title deeds, and therefore there's no zoning, there's no density, and so professionals have been pretty scared to get involved in those contexts because of the kind of the professional risk around working without any kind of policy environment. A place like Alexandra, which we've done work in, which is kind of Johannesburg's oldest township, there's people there that have generationally given their houses to now their kids, and there's still no kind of secure tenure for land. So that's the starting point, is to understand how do we kind of rebuild policy when you look at informal settlements, starting with a land and securing of tenure. Because from that point, you can get to funding from banks, professionals can take responsibility over that, policy can, from City of Joburg, municipalities can build policy around those pieces of land. So that's, for me, the starting point. Architecturally, unfortunately, the speed in which cities are growing now, David spoke a little bit about that. Johannesburg's increasing by 3 people an hour. So it's not just about birth rates. It's urban-rural migration that you're getting into major cities like Johannesburg, and other African cities are also going through the same kind of explosive growth. We're actually not growing as fast as Kinshasa or Lagos, for example. So it's the way in which we build housing has to change. This whole thing of brick and mortar structures that might take a month to build. We have to build houses like we build vehicles. You build a Toyota in 7 hours, 7 to 14 hours. We have to be producing housing that quickly now. So for me, it's more about the speed in which we produce housing, balanced with the secure land tenure. That would be my contribution.
How does that start to shape up in Johannesburg's terms of the growth of informality and the way that that's taken on? And I'm thinking there, Leon, of places like Alexandra, of Diepsloot and so forth that have morphed in over a period of time, quite rapid rates of urbanization, backyards, as well as the RDP type houses. And that's really shaped the landscape, but also the ability of the city to respond to these challenges.
Whether you are in Johannesburg or any one of the cities in the country, we are always daunted by the rate of urbanization that we are faced with every day. Mark expressed it in per hour. I'm referring to stats that says 3,000 people arrive in the city each month. And you cannot visit Diepsloot 1 month and fail to realize that 6 months later, if you're in the same space, how much has already changed in exactly that same spot. We have become better at putting the figures down on a piece of paper and not looking daunted when we express it. But it's both the rate at which it's happening, and then if you add to that the compound pressure in terms of backlogs, what we were faced with in terms of provision of basic services, access to a whole range of especially public services like health and social amenities, and then simply allowing people to move in the city, supporting them to move and access opportunities, which is actually at the core of our urbanization drive. There are so many aspects to this. And I think government has been struggling with this conundrum now for a long time. We're straddling the world of formal and policy and using terms of regulatory language, where the challenges needs to be addressed in more innovative approaches, which is generally in conflict with the pace at which government moves. So when we look at the informal settlements and the problems we need to solve, I think if you look at the policy language the cities use, we would say we are now exploring alternatives. I'm looking at policies that starts to say, how do we provide off-grid solutions to informal settlements that are outside of urban boundaries, for example, and very interesting case studies emerging from Cape Town and other sister cities in the country and in Africa. The cities are definitely looking at it, but as always, I think the reality is way more overwhelming to what we are able to provide as actual solutions on the table. Maybe just one, since we were on such wonderful stats. I like this one from the City of Joburg's housing strategy that said there are more than 455,000 people with a registered housing need in the city of Johannesburg. So obviously we're talking about subsidized housing. And to develop that at the current subsidy rate of 195,000 Rand would cost 88 billion Rand, which is 3 times the national budget for housing at this rate. And it would take us 220 years to eradicate the current backlog. You don't see that in the statement of the president, but that's the reality of the quantum if we continue to think about housing in only in a formal way.
If there is a recipe, and it's a long-term recipe that Leon has described, but you can break it down into a series of components, where does things like the whole question of fuel and efficiency of the buildings, the structures that are going up, how does that conversation really come into this spatial context? What is that recipe for success, and how do we start to communicate it as far down into the communities that are literally emerging by the day?
If you look, Pete, at the roughly 320,000 new households per annum in the country that need accommodation, the Deeds Office tells us that roughly between 60 and 65,000 new houses, formal houses, are making its way onto the deeds registry every year. In a way, that's the simple part of this equation, because those houses are generally controlled by a level of standards which can absorb some additional cost. And ultimately, many of those households in those houses are also more able to adapt to the change of cost up front in order to make that process work. So in terms of what cities would need to do, it's really policing to make sure they are within the legislative condition that is required. The more challenging side of it are the subsidized houses and sites which are being produced. We're seeing that dropping down now below 100,000 units per annum in the country, but nonetheless, that's a very significant delivery. And we need to ask ourselves, why don't those people deserve the same sort of benefits of net zero carbon structures as the more wealthy members of society? In fact, they are the ones most likely to be impacted by the impacts of climate change. So therefore, surely if anyone does want that sort of protection, it would be those households. So the question of what government should be doing and should it cost more? Yeah, it might cost more until the world adapts to the requirements around climate change and building for climate change. But it is absolutely critical that we start thinking about making sure that those houses have the same respect in terms of what they offer their occupants as other houses would. The bigger challenge that I think has been picked up by other people so far is the 120 to 140,000 households that are not in that formal process, who are moving into backyard rental, informal settlements, etc. We see this massive growth of backyard units, outgrowing every other sector by a huge amount. And we know that those units are basically twofold. They are shacks in backyards, or they are very small formal houses in backyards. So what can we do to make those units more livable? That's really going to be the huge challenge. Some of it is around how we plan for them and how we also manage the formalization or the standards that are put in place for those particular units. It's completely possible. It's been shown to work if the cities are able to adapt to that. And then for informal settlements, it's also a huge challenge. But I think just a quick parable is really useful here, that in Poland, there was a new standard that was put in place, quite draconian standard around the level of low E gloss that should be put into all structures across the country. And that was immediately shown to be a huge problem by the sector. Everyone said it was going to add huge cost and we can't comply with it. And there was major outcry to it. A short 2 or 3 years after that, low E glass was being produced lower cost than the original glass because of the technology change. It was specified not only in all buildings for which it was specified, but there was no other glass. So I think that what we need to start thinking about is how we make step changes in how we produce accommodation, rather than just how we cover the cost that seems to be coming around this sort of accommodation. Something that Megan has said a number of times as well is that there is a significant case to show that leading towards net zero is on a reducing cost, increasing potential curve. So every year it becomes cheaper and more effective. So we need to get on that curve, and we need to make sure that when people are choosing their building materials, the choice they have is the one that's going to save energy, even if it's energy in a shack.
Mark, from your side, the role of the informal settlement and its ability, to adapt, the speed that it brings, but also the utility that it affords to the household. Perhaps you just want to bring in your perspective from your side and your experience with designing with these communities.
I think what's important for people to understand is not to view informal settlements or even low-cost housing in kind of this overarching negative light of, we need to save these people and give them kind of modernist city planning borrowed from Europe. I think there's amazing beauty in informal settlements in the way that space has been negotiated and how communities interact with those spaces. So, for example, your streets, get shut down if there's a wedding. There's no policy around that. It's just a cultural agreement on how to use that space. And our amazing climate, outdoor spaces are as important as indoor spaces. So your yard, which is, in Alex, there's this kind of multifunctional space where you hang your washing and chat to your neighbors. Informal settlement has been described as kind of one big house with many rooms, more than what we think of housing in Europe and America is kind of, no, this is my plot of land with my individual house. We can't, unfortunately, that dream doesn't apply in the African context because, we don't have the land and it is hugely wasteful. It creates urban sprawl. So I think the beauty of informal settlements is being able to deliver infrastructure and safety and protection from fire and secure land tender without removing the social aspect of how an African community functions. And that's the beauty around perhaps what, the work that we're doing in Alex and other informal settlements can showcase.
I think both Mark and David address this brilliantly and from slightly different perspectives that both matter. So we've got the kind of the construction sector, hard economic perspective of David, and then from Mark, this really challenging these, I was just sitting listening to him and thinking, wow, that completely new approach to how you consider informal housing and that sort of description of it as one big roof with, these many houses underneath it. And something that came to my mind in the work we've been doing with the net zero carbon building regulation process is just how much our cities are kind of locked into that sort of modernist approach to planning and housing delivery. So I was possibly wanting to ask Liana what her thoughts are around how do you start shifting the culture in that building control office towards one that's more flexible, that in a sense also really respects the professional sort of qualifications of that staff rather than having them just as people who, tick check boxes, but really bringing them in. All of those building control officers come from a variety of different backgrounds, and there should be much more bringing in of that experience into the process. But it is a very different process from a very regulated environment. So that would just be an interesting reflection from a city perspective.
It's about the role of officials and professionals within local government and how we view ourselves. I'm always hopeful that I see change happening because you see new blood coming in. You see youngsters from different perspectives and background, and they enter into spaces like our building development management units, and they haven't necessarily just been institutionalized in terms of the hardcore regulatory part. And they ask questions. They ask questions when we discuss a policy like this, and they say, but how are we going to bring this closer to my community in the south of Soweto? Many discussions are being held about that typical having a presence. Our centralized systems are incredibly unfriendly to our citizens, but having a presence, a footprint in the regions that our metro areas cover, which is hugely extensive. But if we are not more accessible, if we're not prepared to have open days and spend 2 to 3 days a week closer to communities, to have training programs of the draftspersons that submit plans, but training not in the formal way, training in the sense of building that professional capacity, not just so that you have a better plan, but that you have professionals that can engage with communities out there. We are asking questions about how we can use other communication methods to share what we know and what we want. You cannot get away from our city role of also engaging with other spheres of government and asking them questions about the rules and regulations that may be quite unresponsive still to many of the needs that we see on the ground. There are many opportunities, but it was actually an anecdote that was shared by colleagues from Cape Town. And it's about simply professionals working in the Khayelitsha space who identified an opportunity to train on the ground professionals within Khayelitsha to work with the community to actually improve the quality of the building plans, but to basically address the key issues, the issues of safety, the issues of a better house that is more comfortable to live in. And then going back to the city side and saying, how can we then adapt our processes a little bit to be more responsive to the inputs we now get from this community, to actually be able to formalize the housing developments that they can actually create that value.
Dave, if we come into the sort of components and the definition of this sort of net zero carbon buildings, perhaps you can just remind us, reframe this, and then we can start thinking about the concepts and what it means for us within this South African context.
We often have the wrong impression of what net zero carbon looks like. Often it's that great building in Sandton or in Mhlanga Ridge or Century City, which looks beautiful, has these incredibly expensive materials and has 6 stars on the door or whatever. As important as that is, that sector is leading net zero carbon and proper building processes in South Africa. Nonetheless, that when you interpret it into the statistics we've just been speaking about, it doesn't make sense. It's difficult to understand. So let's start with the most simple definition of what net zero carbon residential buildings might look like. It's essentially one that uses as little energy as possible, is as energy efficient as possible. Number 2, it generates whatever it can of its own energy on the site. And number 3, whatever other energy it needs to live its life cycle, it should be procuring from wind or solar or some other renewable energy resource, so that we know that we are not damaging the world through the use of that electricity. So that's at its most basic. If we then look at that, when we were working with Sustainable Energy Africa on this project, we were starting to look at, well, what does that mean for humans, right? In Europe, we know that might end up being a wonderful 4-bedroom house in Germany somewhere. In our context, that's quite different. So we started trying to define what that might be from an African or South African livability perspective. And number 1, we're talking about enhanced amenity. We're talking about being able to live a better life, temperature regulated, with ventilation, with enough light, being able to actually live your life within that structure in a decent way. Number 2, it should really improve your cost of living. It should stop you spending unnecessary amounts on wasted fuel and also on the wrong fuels that happen. Number 3, that residential structure should really do no harm. It should do no harm to the environment, it should do no harm to the city, and it should do no harm to the individual or the family who lives in it. Then it should maximize its efficiency of resource use. So simple things like, we know that 25 to 30% of cement is wasted when you build. That is an incredibly carbon heavy process, and we need to make sure that it's using products properly in the right context with as little waste as possible. And then finally, it needs to be able to choose its own energy mix. And in our South African context of being locked into Eskom, this is an absolutely critical component. If the residential sector started pushing back hard enough and started demanding renewable energy, we would actually start having a very strong lobby for redetermining the country's energy mix, and that becomes absolutely critical. So from that concept, then we then go to saying, well, what are the design considerations? How do you make this happen on a site when you're designing or planning a building? And so often we also think of net zero carbon as what we have to redo to a structure. We have to replace the geyser. We have to replace the windows. We have to do something to the walls to make them more energy efficient. But that's not what we're saying. That's part of the process of reaching the 2050 targets. But more importantly are these 6 things that we need to consider as we go through the design and building process. Number 1, passive issues. Does it face north? Does it have proper overhangs? Does air flow through it? Does sunshine hit it in winter but not in summer? And that can make an incredible difference to the amount of energy that you need in that structure to live a normal life. And if you think about the 4.4 million subsidized units that have been developed, we can be rest assured that around about 20% of those, nearly 1 million units, don't face the right direction. So that very, very basic thing can have an incredibly big impact on the environment and the energy use. Number 2 is insulation. Does the ceiling, the wall, and the piping have sufficient insulation that does not waste energy that you have to then spend a lot of money on heating that or cooling that internal structure? Number 3, does it have efficient lighting and ventilation? Do you need to have a heater when you can have sun coming through the window? Do you need to cool it when you can actually open the window and get ventilation through it? Is there shade when you want it, and is there sun when you want it? So simple things also around LED lighting and the effectiveness of new technology. 4 is fenestration, windows and draft exclusion. When you close a door, does air rush under it? And when sun comes through the window, do you get too hot or too cold? So it's just simple, basic changes in materials with limited additional cost that make a huge difference. Number 5, site level energy generation. What can we do about generating our own hot water and our own solar power from the roof? And there might be other mechanisms, but those are the 2 basic ones in South Africa. You know, the new renewable energy program costs are coming in, and they're talking about 56 to 60 cents per kilowatt hour for solar electricity. Yet we're being charged double that by Eskom. So surely we should be giving everyone the opportunity of making hay from those very, very low energy costs, which are taking over the cost of what Eskom is charging. And then finally, it's the energy source conversion. So how do we get people to not use coal, but use a very efficient energy? How do we get them to move from coal energy to solar or wind energy? And that's got to do with the energy mix we discussed earlier. So those are the basics. And any one or more of those elements that are put into a structure get us towards net zero carbon. It doesn't have to be all, it doesn't have to be instantaneous.
I just wanted to add on to David, because I think he's highlighted kind of the technical side, and I'd maybe just share some experience on the practical side of kind of the work that we're busy with micro housing units. What's the amazing opportunity about net zero carbon and informal settlements is the base understanding is that most of these places don't pay for electricity. So Eskom is losing major revenue when it comes to illegal connections and other things. And so the excitement is around creating microgrids using informal housing, net zero carbon informal housing. If we can have these units have their own solar systems that are feeding back in the grid, there could even be a feasibility subsidy from Eskom that supports that, because again, Eskom is losing money. The second thing is looking at, communities we've worked in, there's kind of 2 major problems that they face that they need housing to solve. Number 1 is just economic security. They're unemployed. They'd love their building to almost make money for them, if that's possible. And the second thing is fire. So the housing units we've designed are not net zero carbon, but net positive. So they're generating 5% more energy than they need. And that becomes an economic financial revenue stream for the person who owns the unit. So this helps them incentive in terms of maintaining the unit. The equipment does need maintenance in terms of protecting the unit from getting stolen. That's how we argue green buildings. The second side of fire is pretty difficult to solve, but there's a couple of low embodied carbon materials that have just started to get on the market, things like CLT, cross-laminated timber, which have very good thermal performance. Again, the links kind of to what David was saying. If you get the thermal performance right in the materials you're choosing at the beginning, it kind of removes the need for even the unit we've designed in Alex doesn't need heating in winter, doesn't need active heating. So that's going back to just making sure the materials that you are choosing are appropriate to that climate scenario. But that has also required us to do pretty complex climate modeling to make sure that the unit works. So there is the professional aspect. I don't think these things can just be solved on the ground. They should start on the ground. But we do need kind of professional input when it comes to making sure that the materials we choose and even the glass we spec and everything else does perform for that specific scenario.
If you're advising the national government or national ministry of energy, or for that matter, human settlements, what would some of the pointers be that you'd give them from a policy point of view, from a design point of view, and recognizing that if not in the housing code, it doesn't happen? So that would be a starting point. And then if the advice was to a municipality, what would that be? And then, David, I'm coming to you. I mean, you've advised government frequently. This is your forte. So let's start with you in terms of saying you've got an appointment with a minister. you're saying which part do you start to shape to get the maximum impact in the shortest period of time?
Firstly, would be to say South Africa is busy finalizing its just transition plan. Where is housing? Where is the built environment? It's not yet clear enough how that features, and we need to ensure that it's well represented in the plan of moving South Africa towards net zero carbon. So that's just around the national scale planning around moving towards carbon targets. Number two would be around talking at the housing sector level of continuing to push the standards to a point that it's reasonable to do so, to make sure that what we are getting is a progressive change of becoming closer and closer to net zero carbon buildings as standard. So that would be around the SAN standards, making sure that we're moving from 10400XA to the new iterations, which are in the process of being drafted, and that we are really starting to move the agenda to make sure that that happens. Number three, there really is not yet a consolidated set of incentives and subsidies that have been thought through from the context of how the built environment works. And that really needs to happen. We've had some excellent programs around hundreds of thousands of solar geysers installed and various movements to other standards and other government building programs, but we don't yet have a consolidated viewpoint of what should happen in the housing sector to change the needle significantly from a national policy perspective. Number four would be to then look at the life cycle of buildings. And we need to get away in housing from this view that what we deliver on day one when we hand the key over is what we consider to be important. We must start thinking about the life cycle costs of putting people into houses they may not necessarily be able to afford. And we must make sure that we are rather looking at producing housing in its broadest sense in a way that is much more related to how people are living their lives and what they need and want in the built environment, instead of being a very static form of unit. That's national. From the perspective of cities, I would say don't wait. The cities have perhaps the largest potential impact of making these things happen. And it is the cities that have also committed to the net zero carbon targets, many of them. So what's absolutely critical here is for those cities to take those challenges and to experiment. And to try some stuff that might not be perfect, but that will definitely start moving towards what we can do, not only for formal accommodation, but also in the informal markets, as Mark has been talking about.
And Mark, from within that sort of professional architectural space, any further thoughts or additions to what David's saying, or alternative angle?
I think for me, I'd firstly like to encourage national government. There was a move towards terminology about upgrading informal settlements, which I think is the right terminology, instead of just demolishing everything and put in blocks of flats. I think that's the right approach. But then that requires a ground up approach with communities. Leon has spoken a little bit about that. And that requires kind of very experienced professionals working directly with communities. And that's kind of hard work. I think professionals are pretty scared of that, just because there isn't a lot of practices specialized in that. But I think it's so necessary for cities and the professional bodies, and even things like universities. I've had ideas that, if you're a doctor or you're a vet, you do 2 years kind of internship. There should be an aspect for architectural students or engineering students, construction students, to be involved in programs like this set up by the city and saying, come do kind of 2 years, helping develop informal settlements, for example. But you do need to have very strong professional kind of oversight in terms of that. The positive is that there are designs that are out there, that can be put up in 4 hours. There are designs out there, but there needs to be a certain amount of bravery from kind of these three spheres to implement. And David touched on it, our greenhouse gas emissions, 80% of that is from energy, half of that is used within buildings. Buildings are such an easy way to just drop the amount of energy we consume. Net zero carbon buildings, you drop that by half, so your large scale renewable projects don't need to be as big. So it starts with efficiency first, but don't just think of efficiency in your building. Let's think of efficiency as a city scale and what that means. So let's start with efficiency first, and then we can spend all our money on these expensive renewable technologies. So that would be my comment.
And Liana, the municipal perspective, you've heard David and Mark talk very eloquently about some of the solutions. Which of those are you busy with now? And which of them do you think make most sense in terms of adapting to what you're already busy with?
From more of a planning perspective, if I think of the informal settlements and the issues we're trying to tackle, you cannot get away from what do you want to achieve and what do you need to do that. We have to review and update our overall strategies and ask the questions, what targets are we chasing and what are the outcomes that we are chasing? There's some of the things we're talking about is still not made explicit in, for example, the city's housing plans. It may be some way mentioned as let's look at improving resource efficiency or usage. But I think if we are more critical about the housing plans, strategies and development programs that we have, that should have quite an explicit statement around climate change, resource efficiency, and overall achieving net zero in a certain time frame. We would definitely be able to be much clearer as to what's required and who do we need to coerce, partner with, get support of. I think that last point is a critical one. If I think of the white paper on climate change, it had explicit statements for all government sectors to consider our approaches and strategies, every sectoral plan that we have. But because climate change is so cross-cutting, the thing that we always struggle with is, what does it mean when you don't just drill down from one perspective, but actually see where the synergies are? And there's wonderful synergies. We will address overall city issues, but also simply resolve it for people on the ground. Maybe just my last comment. I think this question of innovation and exploring is critical. There are interesting projects that's happening in the city with all sorts of wonderful donor funding, but put in a different way, sustainable human settlements departments in the city, with the grants that they get, have significant resources as much as they have significant challenges. And if you actually, almost like the Public Art Initiative in City of Joburg, when you say, let's use 1% of that to test, to innovate, to experiment, and you build up that compendium of pilots and lessons learned and ask the questions, how can this be upscaled? I'm very sure that we can actually make huge strides in a short time.
Megan, if I come to you, I guess a lot of what is being discussed also comes down to this idea of affordability and costs, and the cost of getting to a renewable energy source, a renewable product, and lowering the costs ultimately in terms of the operational as well as the capital costs. Any thoughts from your side around that, Megan?
Thanks, Pete. I think, I've got absolutely no question about the sort of the need to make sure that houses are as efficient as possible. On the renewable energy side, however, I think we have to be a little bit cautious and just, there's a kind of a popular concept out there at the moment that the sun is free. And why are we having to pay? If we put PV on our roofs, why do we have to pay? And the reality is that the sun is free, but the solar PV system is expensive. It's quickly paid back if you use a lot of electricity, but most low-income households aren't using a lot of electricity. So it's a big capital spend item to pay back. Particularly, Mark referred to the fact that in informal settlements, many households are not paying for electricity. So you're competing with a cost of zero. And even where households are buying from the grid, we hear a lot about people sort of struggling to pay for electricity, but the reality is that it's one of the more successful redistribution programs in the country. Low-income electricity is highly subsidized. So again, that makes it quite difficult for solar PV solutions to compete in that space. But I don't want to sound depressing about it because I don't want to shut down the options there. But I think they're going to need some quite interesting innovations in terms of the financing mechanisms and working out, how do you make houses also these kind of net positive generators. So a lot of innovation still needed there. And I think we look forward to a period of innovating into that space. Listening to this conversation, what comes to me so strongly is this need to really reframe the whole net zero carbon concept from the bottom up. And we need to really generate that narrative and make it South African, sub-Saharan African, Southern in a sense. I think that there's been some really exciting ideas, and what Mark said about process is very important, that you do need resources to facilitate processes. And it's not just about dumping technology or dumping a housing unit. It's really about engaging with people. And Liana's really practical solution to say, yes, our government is under huge pressure to deliver quickly, but if we just take a portion of those substantial budgets and we start to be more daring, as Mark challenged us, more daring with that little portion and grow it also from the bottom up, I think that's very exciting.
I wanted to just add that I think the starting point, for example, is that while renewable energy is quite expensive for low-income households right now, I think maybe let's start with energy efficiency, ensuring that their homes are more energy efficient and they're not requiring a lot of energy for those homes to spend money. And I think thereafter, I think, because I think that's where government is already starting to come in when you look at just Slovo, where the homes have been made efficient. So if government could start there, I think we're making a good progress and start to engage as to how we can then make nationally, how we can then start to bring in renewable energy, because to add to individual households to invest in renewable energy or communities, I think we're still quite far from that. So I think getting in and making sure the homes are energy efficient and starting to engage with ESCOM in transitioning our energy sources, that would be, I think, a good start. And also, I think when we talk about this, I'm not sure how much of this message our communities are aware of it. Like when you talk about net zero carbon, is how much of it are we engaging with the communities? So I think if we start to engage with communities as well to make them aware of these movements, of these commitments by government, that will also be a great start.
I mean, Mark, if I come to you, just again from the architectural and the costing of materials, etc. What are some of the key building interventions or materials that might add value but not necessarily cost? And how accessible are those materials to the communities that we're engaging with?
A lot of our inspiration comes from learning about how the communities use materials already. So corrugated iron, for example, is the major material used. Is actually a great material, it just needs to be insulated. So there's a little bit of just professional help that these houses need that can actually make them quite livable. On the other side, you've got new materials coming in like CLT that are more costly in the short term, but obviously what they do in the long term in terms of their thermal performance is amazing. So most people don't know about 70% of the money you spend on your building is coming from you using it from a utility point of view. 30% is the upfront cost. So most of the money you're spending on your building is actually your utilities and maintenance and those things. So we need to frame buildings in the long term, which David has touched on, kind of life cycle analysis, rather than just looking at kind of the short-term cost.
And David, when Megan talks about a reframe, about rethinking and reframing our ambition and some of the themes and the agenda that is driving our future efforts, there seems to be a series of themes that are becoming important. Maybe you just want to elaborate on what those are and how they fit within a new agenda for net zero carbon. We
spent some time thinking about what a net zero carbon built environment might look like and how we might get to such a thing in South Africa in the time period that we need to. And this idea of a South African built environment net zero accord started getting resonance as we were talking to people. And the idea here is that there really is not a united voice for the built environment, let alone for the residential sector in South Africa. So the idea was to say, what would it take for the built environment and for the residential sector to start talking with one voice and to make that voice the new voice that starts bringing in all of these thoughts that Liana and Mark and Hlengiwe and Megan and myself have been talking about. And the idea was really a five-fold process of saying that, number one, we need a unified call to action. We need to stop thinking of it as impossible. We have to recognize that we have to do this. And we need to get all of the voices in the housing sector to speak at one. And that would be the professionals and the administrators and the politicians and whomever else has a role to play, the financiers as well in the sector, thinking about this together in some way. If you don't do that, you are then basically giving away your destiny to whomever makes the decisions. And we feel that, as we've heard today, there's so much that we can learn from different people in the sector to make sure we get that right. So number 2 would then be to jointly negotiate and agree the future destiny of how we start moving towards net zero carbon. This is going to be one of the biggest projects South Africa has to tackle. It has many moving parts, and it'll be important to make sure that there is a joint approach to how that happens. That when government is looking at just transition plans, or the Department of Human Settlements is looking at its new plans, or standards are being put in place, that there's a sense about why this is happening and what we all agree should be happening. Number 3 is we then need to develop a realistic strategy and implementation plan. We can't just imagine this thing. It has to be planned and implemented. So what are we going to do about the standards? What are we going to do about implementing new approaches in municipalities? What are we going to do about ensuring government subsidy programs move towards a more net zero carbon approach? Should we be looking at a national retrofit program that starts driving post-COVID recovery in some way and starts generating economic growth, but also our own South African capacity to drive the environmental and the building change that is needed. So then we need a clear and well-resourced built environment knowledge and resource agenda. There's a lot we know, but there's a lot we don't know. We need more research and development and more testing of these things that everyone has been talking about. Primary design aspects, new materials, industrial constructed housing, what communities can do. There is so much that we can bring into a body of knowledge that can be used by anyone who's interested, in fact. And then finally, to, as I mentioned earlier, look at defining a unified package of built environment incentives and supports to make sure that what government is doing, what money is coming in from international development finance organizations, and what's happening locally within the private sector is being structured in a way that we're getting the best bang for the buck that is being invested in the built environment. So those are some of the key thoughts around how we might build that agenda.
Maybe just to add on to David, I'm part of the Presidential Investment and Infrastructure Office. The president's been talking about this national infrastructure plan with this 340 billion that you've heard on the news. The linkage between infrastructure, not just looking at infrastructure as, adding renewables, but housing. We're starting to break these kind of silos between departments when we're looking at climate change as a whole. And I think that's starting to happen, at least in government circles. But the application comes down to cities, because they know their context the best and have the people and opportunity and can kind of run this professionals in the long term. We don't want to do one housing unit and then there's another 10 years and nothing happens. We need sustainable, development. And that requires people that are committed for the long term. So I think government is starting to understand this from a kind of a top end. But again, I still have to stress it comes down to kind of ground implementing when it comes to housing, because we can't spend another 5 years developing policy and research, without actually, giving people a safe space to bring their kids up underneath.
I'd like to ask Liana for some concluding thoughts from the city of Johannesburg on what she's heard and where to from here.
Pete, simply actually encouraged every time that I have this conversation about this topic, because there's such interest and actually innovation from many stakeholders in this informal sector, low-cost housing, affordable housing sector. It's very challenging, but because there are so many people grappling with this from different perspectives, I'm very confident that we'll get to quite interesting, innovative approaches. Just to wrap it up, I remember my discussion with my housing colleagues the first time when I introduced a net zero policy. It was a very surprising response. They said to me, "Why are you hinting that you may exclude us from this requirement and only demand energy efficiency? Are you telling us that you think we can't do it?" Because we want to tell you we're already doing some very good work around saving people money every month on water and electricity, and saving the city money in not having to overinvest in infrastructure. From a fairly conservative implementing agency like a housing department to say, we're on this. Maybe we won't be there in 2 years' time, but we are heading that way. And a last note, a recent meeting with 15 residents around a table of Alex with their professional team that has actually been consulting for this group for a long time. This group came up with such an innovative concept of redeveloping old Alex. The opening remarks, again, wasn't about housing. It was about, we have this idea to help people earn a living every day. And that earning a living was around the concept of energy, and not just in the way that they will generate additional energy that they can sell, but how that will power the businesses on site and allow the kids to learn. And it was actually so inspiring to understand that residents who's lived in Alex for 20, 30 years and their kids could come around the same table and have a conversation about the future of their block in Alex, with these concepts already included into that, and thinking about how the management of such a concept would work. And they were clear on what they needed the city to do to help them. So they're not waiting for us. They are already saying, we've got this, help us to facilitate it.
So the commitment's there, the energy's there, and the ambition certainly well crafted there in Johannesburg. Thanks again, Liana, for not just this evening, but for all of the inputs that you've given to this series over the last few episodes. Really appreciate it. David, coming to you next. Any sort of concluding thoughts, some framing of the where to next?
Yeah, in conclusion, firstly, I think this is a shift we have to take. There's really not a choice here. We cannot conceptualize this as something that we have the choice not to do if we consider the international and the national context around the need for reductions in climate emissions. Secondly, net zero carbon residential buildings is not a luxury. This, in fact, is more important for people with less income and living in smaller spaces. It becomes much more of a survival prerogative, and those are the people using the major parts of their small resources for energy and living, and it becomes even more important for them. Thirdly, as a country and a sector and as cities and as households, we really can't not do this, because the consequences of not getting it right at all of those levels becomes incredibly severe. We must start thinking as cyclical, the cyclical nature of housing. We tend to be very focused on units and standards in South Africa, but we must consider the fact that what we are putting people in and subsidizing people into, in many respects, can be unaffordable. And this creates the need to look at the life cycle of houses. What happens before we occupy them, what happens while we occupy them, and indeed what happens when we stop using them as well. We must remember the major economic spin-offs that can come from not only the economic activity going into creating net zero carbon buildings, but also the economic spin-offs that come from not wasting people's money on inefficient living conditions. And then I just wanted to highlight the illogic of not doing this. So from government's perspective, on the one hand, we're subsidizing people into houses who many of them cannot afford to live in, basically. And on the second level, we're then, as national and provincial government, handing those units to municipalities and telling them they need to subsidize the services of the people who can't afford the services in the houses through basic service subsidies, etc. So that's a complete illogical cycle that needs to be broken. We need to ensure that we're putting people in houses that give them opportunities to actually live a more affordable life rather than a double subsidy endlessly. And then finally, I think it's important to say that one day this will be normal. We tend to buck at any change, but the bottom line is what we're doing here is we're taking out a legacy of building that's been with us for many hundreds of years, and we're starting to either reintroduce very old concepts of working with nature and the sun, or introducing very new concepts around how to make things more efficient, more affordable, and more scalable as we change the sector.
Thanks to you, David. Thanks for your insights, and your deep dive this evening really has gone in, explained and unpacked in great amount of detail your thinking on this. Very much appreciated. Mark, coming to you next, and any, again, concluding thoughts or additions that you'd like to make?
I just want to make 3 points. The number one is just to cities and encouraging them to not be scared of using existing footprints of informal settlements, and to almost, usually you have to develop an SDP, secure the land, put bulk services. Don't be scared of an existing footprint, and perhaps even start there with existing communities as a basis point. So that would be my one takeaway to the cities. I've spoken a little bit about subsidies, but the private sector is incredibly excited to get involved in low-cost housing development. So, we're speaking to a couple of the banks. So there should be an aspect of blended finance. I don't think we're going to be able to afford to put the housing that we're speaking about up with the existing subsidy. It's just not enough. So, but the banks need some kind of land ownership or architectural drawing to sign off on in terms of tenure. So they need that aspect from kind of the municipal side. And then my last comment is quality. Like, we have to produce quality housing. There's only two things that break generational poverty. Number one is education, and the second is housing that you hand over to your kids. And that expectation is that housing is appreciated in value over the long term. So I think that has to be central to when government is thinking about any kind of housing that they're rolling out mass scale, is the quality aspect.
Again, Mark, really appreciate your insights and your expertise this evening. Good luck with the advice that you're giving, and hope that the messages that you've given us land as effectively with the political masters that you're assisting. So very, very best to you with your endeavors. And then wrapping up with Megan and Hlengiwe, we start to close the circle. Megan, we talked about this series of episodes probably about October, November last year, and here we are starting to close out the full formal series. And Hlengiwe, it'll be good to hear again about where we're going in terms of the webinar and the Q&A session that we're planning in the next month or so. Megan, your thoughts and concluding remarks, not just for this evening, but more generally, the series as a whole.
I'm sort of chuckling at myself because in a way, the structure of this series reflects the kind of tendency to revert to the habitual kind of patterns. And we, as a program, we sort of started with all the kind of traditional building blocks of the regulatory environment, and then we've sort of ended with the informal. In actual fact, the informal is the disruptive. It's the place of the new. It's the place where, the new modern African way is going to be formed. And actually, it's really the heart. And hopefully what we can do with this is, take this into the next phase and really try to add to this new kind of beating heart and really prioritize it. So from my side, an enormous thank you to all of the experts that have made input through the process. One thing that comes across from all the discussions is that this is a complex system transition, if ever there was. It involves so many different elements, and all of those elements have to come together in some way for the cogs to work. That it doesn't have to be one system, but there has to be this kind of interaction and all these cogs working together. And I think the discussions that you've held in this Talking Transformation series have been a part of that process. So thank you very, very much.
An absolute pleasure, Megan, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to partner you on this. And Hlengiwe, thank you again for all of your efforts behind the scenes, all the preparation that's gone in, the logistics and so forth, and some concluding thoughts from your side.
Thank you, Pete, and thank you for hosting us. These last 4 episodes, it's really been great. And thank you to our guest speakers who have said yes, and Liana, who has come in I think for the past 2 episodes that Liana has joined us, it has been last minute involvement. So thank you, Liana, for coming in at any time we ask. Thank you so much. In conclusion, I think this is our last episode, and then hoping that everyone that has been listening to us can come and join us to engage with our speakers that have spoken in our last four in all our episodes that we have recorded. So I really hope that you'll be able to join us in this webinar. This will be a live webinar. Pete will be hosting us again, and all our guest speakers will join us again. The webinar will be on the 27th of May, which is a Thursday in the next 3 weeks, and we will be recording from 5:30 p.m. And hopefully we'll keep the conversation going up until 6:37 if people are really interested. So please join us. All the details will be available on our LinkedIn page, Sustainable Energy Africa's LinkedIn page. So, and we'll email those who are interested with RSVP details and with the Zoom link as well. So I hope everyone will be able to join us. Thank you.
Thanks, Hlengi. We appreciate that. Look forward to the webinar and the Q&A. And really, it's going to be great to have everyone back in the room and a chance to reflect on the 4 episodes and the questions that arise from that. And that's where I think it's going to be very interesting, not only to hear from the different voices that we've already heard from, but also from those people who have actually had a chance to take on something new, learn about this particular topic, and now have a chance to ask the experts. So very exciting to revisit. With that, colleagues, all the very best. Thank you for your time and effort. Keep safe and look forward to checking in with you at the live webinar in the coming weeks. All the best.
Thank you.
Pete and all my colleagues.
Have a great evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Cheers, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Cheers, Megan. Cheers,
Thank you
Hlengi.
so much, all. Really appreciate the time.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Talking Transformation podcast. Please engage with us and let us know your thoughts on this episode. You can do so via the Anchor podcast platform. There's a voice message function available via the app. You can also follow us on Twitter via Talking Transfo and the number 1. So Talking Transfo 1. Our theme music is kindly made available by Tribal Need. Find out about the music, the street art shows here in Cape Town and Europe via tribalneed.com.